The hand that reached for the watch belonged to the man in the suit. The hand that trembled belonged to someone who had wiped this floor for 14 years. On polished marble, under the glare of recessed lights, a small gold rectangle flashed and slid. It caught the light and then the world. Derek Callahan's shoes stopped beside it. He bent, picked it up, and turned as if performing some small, inevitable task. Around him, the executive suite held its breath. Gleaming chairs, expensive art, a silence in which a single object felt obscene. "Get your black hands off my desk," Callahan said. The words snapped across the room like a thrown knife. They landed not only on the janitor's shoulders, but on the portrait of a life folded into janitorial foam and keys. Stanley Walker stood with a bulging canvas bag slung over one shoulder, a rag half tucked into his back pocket, the worn photo of a woman his fingers sometimes smoothed when no one watched. He said nothing. He had never learned to shout at people who shouted at him. Callahan stepped forward and yanked the bag from Stanley's hand. Papers leaked out like private things becoming public. A sweater, a dented thermos, a small water-stained photo of a woman with laugh lines, Eleanor, a thin, tired face, a hospital bracelet in one corner of the frame. Callahan dumped the bag on a glass desk. The watch lay on top like an accusation with an appraised value. Around them, phones came up. Someone filmed, someone else whispered, and the tape of the moment was already beginning before Stanley had time to breathe. Linda Crawford from HR hovered at Callahan's shoulder and read already the lines she had been trained to read. Theft, company property, immediate action required. Her fingers moved at the policy's tempo, quick, decisive, paperless. By 2:45 a.m., an email had gone out from Linda's account, short, clinical, stamped with urgency and the company letterhead. Subject, immediate employment action. Recipient, security, IT, facilities. Content, effective immediately. Stanley Walker's badge access was revoked, suspended pending investigation. The email existed in that strange amber of administrative inevitability, a single click that could rewrite a man's night, a document that could be printed and shown to anyone who wanted proof he had been taken at his word. That was the morning the building stopped being merely a building and began to be a courtroom. Stay with us. The truth is in what the cameras saw. After the opening, the scene cooled. The narration moved back, collected, and gave us Stanley's life like a slow camera panning over worn but resilient furniture. He rose when the sky was ink dark, clipping the badge to the same hole in his jacket. He left a small stack of unpaid bills beside the receiver. He kissed Eleanor's forehead, soft in the way people who have loved together over decades kiss, the kind of gentleness that reads like confession. She slept with a machine that hummed at the foot of the bed. Her heart, a weathered engine, needed brakes and mercy. Eleanor's hospital bracelet had been a recent addition. The world had narrowed to medication schedules and small kindnesses. Stanley's dignity took shape in routines. The sweep of the mop, the rhythm of the squeegee, the uncluttered pride in a job done well. He had worked nights so others could work days. He had learned the faces of the building, the janitors on third shift who smoked current cigarettes outside the service door, the overnight security guard who preferred chess in his head to conversation, the interns who left their ambition on the 15th floor and forgot it by Monday. He had his own rituals, tea at midnight, a small radio on low, a sandwich for two at the microwave that was never used by anyone else. He had a wallet with an eclipse of doodled coupons, the sort of wallet people keep for years because it stores more than currency. When he wiped the executive floors, he did it without fuss. He did it because someone had to. So when Callahan pulled the bag, the dignity did not snap. It stayed intact like a silent reserve. Stanley knew the rules. He had been wronged by the spectacle. He had been humiliated without answers. He walked out with the badge already disabled by an email that had been sent before the cameras had even stopped rolling. Word moved faster than compassion. The rumor mill inside the glass and steel tower performed its efficient cruelty. Phones flicked on, messages multiplied. Janitors stole a watch became a headline in the internal chat. People who would have given him a nod on the elevator found it difficult to meet his eyes. Security put a polite distance between Stanley and the staff entrance. The badge, once a key to a small, dependable freedom, became a symbol of exclusion. Back at home, Eleanor woke to kitchen lights and Stanley's footsteps that did not halt at the bedroom door. He put down his bag and moved to sit by her. Her breathing was shallow, the kind of shallow that carries a lifetime and insists on being noticed. She blinked up at him, then returned to sleep. He smoothed the blanket. He radioed the shelter that kept the small oxygen concentrator on its schedule. He sat alone at the table and folded his hands around a coffee that had gone cold, and held his face as the building's humiliation leaked into the house like a stain.
Neighbors said things with the delicacy of people who don't know what to say. "I'm sorry," they offered, which was a small comfort but did nothing to change the next bill. A well-meaning charity call passed on the line like a neutral bird. The payments piled up. Eleanor's next doctor's appointment loomed like a candle in a gusting wind. Meanwhile, above them, the office had its own set of rituals, ones less forgiving.
Derek Callahan had been fast, charismatic, and brash since the day he arrived in a suit that cost more than the household where Stanley had been born. He carried urgency like armor. He made decisions like weather. The watch was a symbol of success in that world, a diamond-encrusted statement that ticked loud enough to drown out conscience. If it had gone missing, the narrative that advanced itself on Callahan's lips was pre-packaged and invaluable. Someone low in the hierarchy had stolen from someone high. The optics were tidy. But a tidy narrative sometimes required tidy evidence. Callahan did not wait for time to make him look credible. He used the office's machinery to make an event feel resolved before anyone could ask questions. He instructed HR, and HR sent the email. He stood over Stanley in the presence of cameras and senior staff and made sure that the image of accusation was the thing people took home in the pockets of their phones. It was the way power makes law, through gestures that become proof if no one bothers to examine film. Grace Thornton had always seen film. As senior auditor for the company, she spent hours following the traces people left behind. Ledger lines, server logs, time-stamped entries that end-to-end told a story you couldn't ignore. She had been in the company long enough to detect the slight tremor when something didn't add up. The night after the confrontation, the footage of the executive floor had been flagged in her queue less for sensational content than for the anomaly. An expensive object disappearing from an executive's office was supposed to trigger an internal audit. What she found instead were questions written into pixels. She scrubbed the footage with the care of someone trained to find what others missed. The security system dated the clip with numbers at the corner. 01:47:12 a.m. A grainy figure stepped into frame, tall, in a dark suit, then reached down. A watch flashed. The man adjusted his sleeve. He turned, he brought his hand to his belt, and in that exact second, the timestamp read 01:47:34. The camera panned momentarily, then caught the man at a drawer, fishing discreetly inside. Later frames showed him standing, smoothing his jacket, and walking away. It was a small sequence, a pocket of motion that, when examined frame by frame, became an explanation for the missing watch. Grace pulled up the badge logs next. They were a bureaucrat's truth. Time, place, person. A ledger that didn't prefer nuance. Stanley's badge had been scanned on the 12th floor at 01:47:33 a.m. The system reported him 26 floors and several minutes away from the executive suite at the exact second the footage showed the man in the suit bending over the drawer. In the sterile numbers, there was a contradiction that smelled like an alibi. Grace printed time codes in her mind the way other people printed to-do lists. The footage suggested that the watch had never left the building on someone else's hands. It suggested, quietly, a different possibility, that the object had been moved by someone with access and the certainty that a quick accusation would bend the house story to their will. People talk about evidence as if it is a thing. Grace had come to understand that evidence is a small coalition of things: images, letters, timestamps, and the stubbornness of a person who will not let an irregularity sit unexamined. She saved clips, timestamped every frame she could, and then looked for motive. There were gaps in her spreadsheet, no smoking gun in an expense report, only shadows. But in the executive email account, a thread showed a series of messages with a subject line whose contents had been redacted for privilege. Grace requested access under audit authority and got a handful of items: an expense policy query here, a corporate event follow-up there. One exchange, however, stood out. It suggested something like pressure, an instruction to reconcile personal reimbursements with a tone that smelled of urgency. Grace noted it and left an asterisk for later. Marcus Brown had been there in the hum of that night, a janitor who worked the same shift as Stanley. He had seen Callahan at the lobby earlier in the evening, could have sworn he'd seen the man wearing a watch so bright the diamonds were like tiny suns. Marcus was quiet by nature, the sort of man who remembered faces more than names. He had a wife and a child and kept his head down. When Grace approached him for a recollection, his hands fumbled with their cigarettes and then stopped. He remembered. He remembered the watch and a way the man's palm had brushed the band like ownership, but he stopped short of saying out loud what he had seen later on the monitors. The reluctance was not fear of being wrong, it was the fear of being visible. Marcus worried about retribution, about being drawn into executive storms where he had no shelter. Nobody wanted to be the loud voice stepping into a company room where suits could make livelihoods disappear with an offhand memo. He delayed, asked Grace whether she was sure she wanted his statement, and when she said yes, provided a clumsy, honest recollection. "I saw Mr. Callahan wearing it earlier by the lobby," Marcus said, voice low. He turned to the floor and added, "I didn't think nothing of it." Grace filed Marcus' observation in the same folder with the footage. Evidence is patient when kept under lock. Meanwhile, within hours of the accusation, Callahan had picked up the phone. He didn't leave the scene to faith. He used the only other power he trusted, the corporate infrastructure. He called IT and HR, urging expediency and discretion, and mentioned, in a voice that brooked no questions, that the matter should be considered urgent. He requested the archive be cleared, old footage culled, redundant files deleted, anything that might complicate an immediate narrative if pursued. The request was logged.
Someone in IT noted the call as priority. Linda typed the termination memo as if engraving a statue. The company's machinery, well-oiled and pride of conscience by habit, moved. But audit departments exist for the precise reason that systems can be too obedient to the wrong hands. Grace's role carried the authority to freeze data. She used the policy she had studied for years and initiated a preservation hold. She sent a terse note to IT with an audit code. The system responded with a small bureaucratic confirmation that felt like a legal sigh. Hold initiated. The camera's raw feeds were safe, for the moment, from deletion. The very instant of Callahan's instruction became, if only briefly, a traceable action. The company's own record would show he had placed the call. The call itself would be metadata. Metadata is the poetry of bureaucracy. It tells a story by how things were touched. At home, the humiliation had seeped into Stanley like cold water. Eleanor's visits to the hospital became more frequent. On the third night after the accusation, the machine at the foot of her bed blinked erratically, and a nurse's hand smoothed the sheet. Stanley sat by the chair and let himself be present in the manner of people who do not have resources but have insistence. He read instructions written in stilted pen, and he memorized medication names. His son, Harold, had known for years, that his father worked nights, but family had its separate rules. Harold Walker had been the kind of son who kept his father's life in a private compartment. He had moved up the corporate ladder while keeping the knowledge of his father's position as a night janitor on the other side of a line he drew for reasons of dignity and shame that blurred into each other. He had not expected his father's world to intersect with his in a public spectacle. When the first message came, an urgent call from Rachel Simmons, the lawyer Grace had consulted, Harold's morning cup of coffee sat untasted. He listened, then listened more. His jaw tightened, not with anger alone, but with a complicated mixture, professional embarrassment, paternal alarm, and an instinctual demand for justice. Rachel was not a zealot. She was a corporate lawyer who had represented individuals through tough patches and knew the contours of institutional response. She advised caution. She told Grace to preserve everything. She told Harold to keep calm. She took Marcus's reluctant statement and wrote it into a formal witness affidavit, translating memory into a document that could be used in a boardroom. She sent a terse email to the company's legal counsel detailing possible retaliation, potential libel, and the need for an impartial review. The lawyer's language was exact, like a scalpel poised but not yet incised. As days passed, the pieces arranged themselves. The footage, the badge logs, Marcus's recollection, the call to IT, and then the single, damning administrative timestamp, 2:45 a.m. When Linda's email went out suspending Stanley, the timing suggested more than coincidence. It suggested a story had been prepared ahead of time. Grace found, as she continued to review the files, a trail that pointed to a preemptive move, an email drafted and sent that preceded some of the usual investigatory steps. It struck Grace with the force of a discovery that was both factual and moral. Someone had tried to make the narrative before the facts were examined. When the ledger of human motive was opened, another page suggested itself. Grace found an internal note that, to an outsider, meant little. To someone who knew the hidden habits of executives, it read differently. Callahan's expense line had been irregular in the last quarter. There were reimbursements, quick transfers, and a note of a shortfall in a personal account. Privately, in interviews, a few people had muttered about risky habits. Grace did not say the word gambling without reservation. Evidence did not let her yet, but she placed the word appears in her notes. Callahan appears to have had financial pressure in the weeks before the incident. That phrase, cautious and measured, was all that responsibility allowed. Still, motives are the least reliable currency in a courtroom of cameras. The footage and logs mattered more. Grace compiled a packet,
cropped stills from the 0147 footage, a printout of the badge log with Stanley's 014733 entry on the 12th floor, the 2:45 a.m. HR email with the effective immediately subject, and Marcus Brown's signed recollection. She put them in a PDF and stamped it with audit timestamps, as if to say, "Here lies a sequence. It is available to anyone with eyes." But evidence, however conclusive, requires an audience willing to look. The boardroom was the place for such an audience. Harold, when he read the packet, felt the sensation of a world tilting back into its axis. He had kept his father's nighttime labor out of his life for reasons he now could no longer justify. The neat separations between their worlds, the marble and the mop, the suits and the rags, collapsed into a shared set of facts. Callahan, sensing the first wind of a storm he had not expected, did not remain idle. He reached out to the board informally, casting the narrative as he wished it to be understood: decisive action, swift justice, protection of company assets. He framed himself as the executive who had found and corrected a problem. He sent short, confident updates that folded the event into a narrative that made him the savior of corporate order. The board listened. They called for a formal meeting to address the theft and the propriety of executive oversight. It was the sort of meeting that could either end a career or merely note a hiccup on a quarterly report. Grace asked for patience. She asked for time. She sat in a small room where the lights buzzed and watched the footage again.
The man in the suit, the watch flashing, the drawer opening, each frame bore a quiet accusation. She felt, suddenly, the closeness of a moral obligation that was also professional, to get it right. Harold picked up the phone and dialed with the kind of steady hand people use when they plan to alter a household's entire structure. He called his father. Stanley answered in a voice that had folded years into small syllables. Harold did not berate or demand. He simply said, "We will look into it." He took the truth like a man taking up a new responsibility. He did not tell his father the exact mechanisms he would use. He promised action. For Stanley, the promise was a small, precious thing, not spectacle, but recognition. There were moments when the two worlds touched in the smallest, most human ways. Marcus, after a night of thought, went to Stanley's house with a slow apology and a plate of soggy takeout. He hovered on the threshold like someone offering a poor kind of comfort. Stanley accepted the food. They sat in the quiet and let the television blare without watching. Marcus's presence, awkward and honest, mattered more than any speech. It was the kind of solidarity that did not look like heroics, but was a necessary bandage. Grace assembled her notes in the law office where Rachel met her after careful phone calls. Tables became maps, sticky notes with times, printouts spread like a forensic cross-section. Rachel's fingers tapped a pen against the table. She did not speak of trial strategy, but of immediate remedies, an injunction against destruction of evidence, an internal review committee, a request for preservation orders. It was practical work for the kind of small compassion institutions sometimes allow, paperwork that could protect the integrity of a man's life from being edited away. The board meeting was set with the efficiency of the order that governs corporations. Harold asked for a private conversation with the chairman. He did not yet air his father's role in the building. He asked instead for a careful review. He wanted the camera's raw files. He wanted the badge logs printed in ink and not merely viewed on a screen. He wanted to keep the personal from being used against the institutional. For Harold, this was an unspooling of something he had kept quiet, his father's humility and his own resultant complicity in keeping it quiet. Callahan walked the halls with the certainty of a man who believed in his own narrative. He answered questions with the lightness of someone who thought the weight of proof would bend to the weight of reputation. He did not expect the quiet vigilance of auditors and the slow accumulation of administrative records. By the time Grace had assembled the packet and Rachel had read it, and Marcus had signed his statement, and Harold had placed the first call to the chairman, the problem that had been reduced to a sensational headline had become, in the sober light of documentation, a set of contradictions. They were not yet a verdict. They were, however, a map for where the next steps must lead. In a small evidence room, not yet touched by the glare of reporters, someone secured the watch. It sat in a tamper-evident bag, cold and inert. It no longer flashed like accusation. It flashed like an object that could be read in many ways. The watch could be an ornament or an instrument of a lie. For those looking, it was a key. Stanley returned to the building days later, not as a man triumphant, but as someone who had endured. His badge did not grant him the same doors. He walked the public sidewalk and then the service entrance, and he mopped and swept and let the rhythm of work do what it always had, keep him tethered to a life that included more than humiliation. He answered, when asked about the watch, with the kind of simple honesty that does not need to be loud. "I don't have it," he would say,
and the sentence fell like a stone that makes concentric rings. The stage was set. The evidence lay in packets. The board had been alerted. Harold had a packet of his own and a face full of paternal worry. Grace had the footage that showed a man with a watch in the executive suite at 01:47 a.m. and a shadow of a hand tucking something into a drawer. Marcus had told what he had seen in the lobby. Rachel had filed the preservation requests. Linda's email sat with its 2:45 a.m. stamp like a small, damning artifact of procedural haste. But no final judgment had been passed. Callahan continued to walk the halls with a smile that did not yet know how brittle it would soon become. He kept his office light on late into the night, sometimes dialing numbers that would not appear in the audit, speaking in tones that sought to make the problem disappear. He attempted at one point to withdraw the archive preservation request, an informal gesture intended to smooth over a wrinkle before anyone noticed it. The attempt failed. The system had logged the preservation hold. There was now a digital trace of an attempted erasure. The trace, when noticed, did not comment on itself, but became a breadcrumb on which investigators could hang a broader theory. Stanley sat in a plastic chair in the hospital corner where Eleanor rested and read her a passage from an old book. He kept his voice level. He had been accused, stripped of his badge, seen in the footage of a bag search in which the object fell out as if by accident, and labeled by the CEO who had not yet been scrutinized. He did not demand the whole world. He asked for his name back, and a life not permanently altered by a false narrative. Grace thought often of small things, the broken clasp of a watch strap, the way someone might hide an object in a drawer because a drawer is where you keep the things that weigh you. She thought of the human economies behind expense accounts and how quickly a need can become a small disaster. She thought of the way systems can be weaponized by those who understand them.
She thought, too, of a janitor's wallet folded under a lone photograph and how, given time and attention, the facts could realign to tell a truer story. When Harold finally stood before the board to request a formal meeting with full disclosure of the audit packet, he did so with the quiet force of someone who had decided to bring a private hurt into a public place. He did not shout. He did not dramatize. He placed the evidence on the table. He told the board who his father was. In that moment, the small compartmentalization he had maintained for years dissolved like salt in water. The family tie was not meant to be a weapon. It was instead a demand for justice that crossed the contours of corporate dignity. There was a moment of real silence. Board members looked at one another. Some shifted in chairs built to make them appear steady. Thomas Bennett, Margaret Hayes, Robert Kim, David Okonkwo, Patricia Vance, names that would be read in the minutes, met one another's eyes. They had dealt with risk, with revenue, with image. They had not yet had to deal with the collision of the two in a room where the sun asked them to consider not only corporate litigation, but the dignity of an elderly man whose night work had been narrated away. Outside the boardroom, people continued to gossip. Inside, a different mechanism hummed. The company had to decide whether to speak in the stale form of a press release or to allow the facts to be examined. It had to decide whether to trust its auditing structures or to let reputation rule without scrutiny. Grace's packet sat under her arm as she waited beside the closed door. In her mind, she rewound the footage one more time, the frame at 01:47:34, Callahan's sleeve catching light as he reached into a drawer, then the badge log, Stanley on the 12th floor at 01:47:33. The coincidence felt impossible. She prepared to tell the board what the images showed and to let the room's own machinery decide whether to believe a CEO's word or a collection of quiet facts. The watch, once an instrument of accusation, had become mute, a little trophy of a story that was no longer only Callahan's to tell. It was evidence now, bound for a process that would, if the corporation held to its own policies, examine itself in the mirror. But everyone knew how these things could go. A well-spoken man could shape a version of events fast enough to make it stick. Power often spoke first, questions came later. Grace had the forensic patience. Harold had the familial impetus. Marcus had the memory. Rachel had the legal pen. Stanley had his life to reclaim. The boardroom held its breath. The packet unsealed a series of decisions that would test not just policy, but values. Calls buzzed under the table. Legal counsel coordinating. A county prosecutor's office notified that a referral might be forthcoming. Media teams on standby for the moment the company issued a statement. The machinery of consequence was as well oiled as the machinery Derek Callahan had used to compose his own narrative. In a hallway outside, a housekeeper mopped an immovable path. In the executive suite above, the watch slept in evidence packaging. The air in the building felt different.
charged not with the static of gossip but with the weight of possible accountability. No verdict had been reached, no courtroom had yet convened, but the small coalition of truth, timestamps, logins, a reluctant witness, a lawyer ready with paperwork, had taken shape. The next meeting would not be a spectacle for phones so much as a legal and moral turning point. It would be the place where the company's leadership would either side with an executive's cut of events or allow the documentary proof to reshape their judgment. Stanley did what he always did. He showed up to work when his feet could carry him, and he kept his head down. He mopped. He checked the minor sockets and cords that hummed in the night. He smiled at the security guard who didn't know what to say. He carried on his rituals the way someone keeps a promise to a person who needs them more than they need applause. Outside, the sun rose on a city that had no idea the small dramas that could change a life were being played out within the glass walls of one building. Inside, the boardroom door opened. What would they see when the footage played? What would they do when a son stood and said, "This is my father"? The watch sat in its bag, an inert prize in a case that smelled faintly of plastic. Evidence, it seemed, had a slow gravity. It pulled people toward a version of the truth that might take time to reveal itself fully. Harold crossed the threshold and placed the packet on the table. The room shifted. Chairs scraped. Eyes read the heading. Audit packet. Executive theft inquiry. CCTV footage and badge logs. There was no drama in the words. The drama was in the frames that would play in a moment, pixel by grainy pixel. At that threshold, things paused. The board prepared to watch. The building waited to see whether the machinery of power would bend toward accountability or continue its tidy rearrangement of facts to suit convenience. Outside, in a house that smelled of tea and medicinal creams, Stanley sat with Eleanor and read aloud until she slept. He did not know whether his badge would be restored. He did not know whether the incident would cause more trouble than it cured. He only knew that they had each other, and that dignity had a way of persisting in small gestures. The boardroom lights came on. The first frames of the footage loaded. The watch flashed in the grainy rectangle. The story had not yet been closed. The truth waited for its turn at the microphone. The grain of the footage filled the screen like an old photograph brought to motion. The timestamp in the lower corner read 01:47:12 a.m., the numbers clicking forward as if counting out a secret.
The room watched a man in a dark suit cross the carpeted expanse of the executive suite, the camera catching the flash at his wrist. The clip moved in small increments, a hand bending, a sleeve brushing a drawer's edge, the unmistakable motion of something being tucked away. Then 1:47:34, a stillness that felt louder than any statement Derek Callahan had ever made. Grace spoke quietly, with the calm of someone who had already seen the pattern many times. Frame by frame, you can see him put an item into the top drawer and close it. The badge logs show Mr. Walker on the 12th floor at 1:47:33. The two timestamps are essentially simultaneous. She let the numbers lie on the table like an accusation that did not require shouting. Callahan sat at the far end of the table with his jaw set. He watched the clip through the same pixelation everyone else saw. He watched the badge log projected beside it, the line showing Stanley Walker's scan at 1:47:33 on the 12th floor. His mouth did something like a concession for a second, an almost smile that did not reach his eyes, before he cleared his throat and reached for a defense that had been rehearsed in his head since the cameras had first rolled in his hallway. "This is selective framing," Callahan said, voice practiced. "The footage is ambiguous. Mr. Walker's presence on the 12th floor doesn't prove anything about the executive suite." He consulted the notes in front of him as if the paper could reconfigure the pixels into an exoneration. "We have a theft. Immediate action was warranted to protect company property." Harold rose slowly. He had not risen as the son with a need for vindication. He rose as the son who had decided to bring an old life into a new room and let it stand there in the light. "If we are asking about what the cameras show," he said, "let us ask why those cameras show a CEO wearing the watch at 1:47 a.m. and then reaching into a drawer." He did not shout. He did not flinch. The statement was simple, surgical. Patricia Vance was the first to lean forward. "We are being shown a clip, Mr. Callahan," she said. "We are being shown a badge log with a timestamp. We have an HR email dated 2:45 a.m. ordering suspension. We have an IT log that records a request to remove archived footage. These are administrative actions that look coordinated.
Her voice held the sort of professional neutrality that read like a lever gently applied.
Then, an attempt to rescind the preservation appeared as an IT note. The attempt, invisible to those who did not look, had failed. The audit trail recorded it all. Margaret Hayes tilted her head. "We have a possible misconduct issue and possible obstruction of evidence. Whether that's criminal is not our job to determine," she said, "but it is our job to protect the company and to act on demonstrated misuse of authority." For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the projector. The footage looped, the numbers flipping like a metronome. Outside the glass, offices were occupied by people who had traded a headline for a human life, and would, after the meeting concluded, file their impressions into the small boxes of their memory. Inside, the responsibility felt heavier than any quarterly report. Callahan tried to reframe. He called attention to security footage gaps he claimed existed, to the human fallibility of camera angles, to the rush of an executive's life. It was rhetorical smoke, clever, quick, but the packet on the table kept returning the conversation to something else, precise timestamps, an HR email sent at 2:45 a.m. that had the effect of suspending a life without investigation, and an IT log that showed an attempted purge after the fact. Those three items chained together formed a narrative that could not be waved away by charm. Grace clicked to a second screen and pulled up the HR message. The header read in clear corporate font, subject, immediate employment action, time sent, 02:45 a.m., sender, Linda Crawford, recipient, security, IT, facilities. A board could see the text. Effective immediately, Stanley Walker's badge access will be revoked, suspended pending investigation. The words felt small and human when spoken aloud. On paper, they functioned like a formal blade. Linda Crawford, seated not far from the table, looked down at her notes and did not speak at first. Her role was procedural. Her actions, once ordered, were fast and recorded. When she finally addressed the room, she did so in the voice of someone who had followed a directive. "I acted on the direction I was given. I sent the email at 02:45 a.m. because that is what Mr. Callahan requested me to do," she said. Her admission was factual, not defensive. It made the chain of command visible. The conversation pivoted toward motive with the caution of people who understood the difference between suspicion and proof. Grace did not make claims she could not document. She said only what her packet allowed. "There are irregularities in Mr. Callahan's expense and reimbursement activity. It appears there were transfers and reconciliations inconsistent with his prior filings. There is also a recorded call from him to IT asking for expediency and archive manipulation. Those facts, together with the footage, suggest this incident may have been constructed to create a narrative before a full audit could occur."
The phrase "appears to have" framed the accusation in the language of a professional who knew how the world of evidence required patience. Harold did not look away. He listened as a son, then spoke as a citizen of the company whose trust had been misused. "My family and I have kept certain parts of our life private," he said. "I did not bring my father's work here to exploit it. I brought this packet because the company must answer to its own rules." Robert Kim, a man whose demeanor had been built around balance sheets and steady hands, closed the folder and stood. Given the footage, the badge log, the HR action timed well before any formal investigation, the IT record of attempted deletion, and the appearance of financial stress, these are enough to justify immediate action by the board. He rattled off the motions with a clerk's precision. Suspend the CEO pending investigation. Refer the matter to the company's legal counsel and consider notification to law enforcement. Place an interim executive in charge. The motions landed one after the other like measured gavel strikes. Callahan, who had expected the board to swallow his explanation as if politeness could substitute for inquiry, found that the room did not intend to be polite. He rose at last, his voice raising into something that almost cracked. "You can't do this based on a clip you can edit," he said. "You can't smear someone with unverified logs." Grace looked at him slowly. "The logs are stored in multiple servers. They were preserved before any deletion request succeeded. We have chain of custody records. We have witness statements. This is not a smear attempt. It is a documentation of events." Thomas Bennett tapped a pen against his knee and then placed it on the table. He read the table's composition, stock, reputation, lawsuits, shareholder letters, then looked at the faces that had been gathered because of one afternoon's spectacle. "We authorize immediate termination for cause," he said finally. "We will refer the evidence to the district attorney for review. We will appoint an interim CEO. We will cooperate with whatever external inquiry is requested." The motion passed by a narrow but formal count. Callahan's face, which had worn a defiant composure, showed for the first time a fissure. He made a single brisk attempt to argue procedure, legal counsel, contractual protections, but the company acted in the overlap between risk and ethics. There was now an obligation to its employees to show that the machinery that punished could also be used to protect. A security officer took Derek Callahan's access card at the end of the meeting, and the badge he had once wielded like proof of dominion click-clacked into a desk drawer. That small act, mechanical administrative, had the feel of symbolism without flourish.
The board issued a terse statement to employees. The company placed the CEO on administrative leave pending an internal and external review. It could not comment further. Outside the glass, the rumor mill that had once worked to crush Stanley shifted, shamed and slow. The internal chat that had quickly turned the word thief into a headline now sat quieter. The earlier videos that had glorified the accusation replaced by a more cautious tone. People who had flinched to judgment felt the edges of that judgment soften in the face of evidence. In small, incremental ways, the building began to correct its arc. Rachel Simmons drafted a preservation order and sent it to both the company counsel and the county prosecutor's office. The accompanying email was clinical in tone. Please consider this packet as evidence of potential internal fraud and obstruction. We request a review. She did not promise outcomes. She requested due process. The professionals at the prosecutor's office answered that the referral would be logged and evaluated, as procedure demanded. The language held distance, neither exoneration nor condemnation, but it carried with it the knowledge that a public report might follow. Harold called his father from the boardroom before the formalities dispersed. Stanley's voice on the line was low and unreadable, a man who had spent years transforming his life into small certainties, a pill organizer, a tea schedule, an oxygen machine check. "They are doing something," Harold said, careful with the words his father would understand as comfort. "It's not over, but it's moving. They watched the footage." Stanley's reply was plain. If the truth is true, it will show. It was not defiance. It was the way people who have been accustomed to quiet labor speak about reputation, as something you hold, not as something you plea for in public. The company issued an internal memo acknowledging the preservation of evidence and announcing an independent internal review. The communication expressed regret over the incident's effects on employees and promised transparency. It was, in its tone, protective and slow. For Stanley, it felt like a small writing, a bureaucratic correction whose personal gravity would be measured in the restoration of a badge, and more importantly, a name. Callahan announced through counsel that he would cooperate. The statement, thin and brief, promised an internal review and the company's right to due process. It made no admission. It did not need to. The board had already acted on evidence the company itself had verified. The watch, now an inert object in a tamper-evident bag, sat under evidence lock. It would be catalogued, photographed, and held. It was, in effect, neutral until investigators, internal or external, gave it a meaning the law would recognize. Stanley returned to work not as a marked man, but as a man whose badge, after formal review, was re-enabled. The card scanner beeped a familiar tone that felt like permission. He walked to the service elevator and rode when no one watched so he could keep a little of his dignity private.
Colleagues who had been quick to record his humiliation now offered brief nods that acknowledged their mistake without ceremonious apology. Marcus, in the break room, let his shoulders relax in a way that suggested some pressure had been lifted. The company disciplined several employees for procedural failures related to the incident, but the board's announcement carefully stopped short of implicating HR, beyond acknowledging that Linda Crawford had acted on a superior's instruction. Linda remained an employee whose action had been recorded as part of the chain of events. The company promised additional training and a review of protocols for immediate employment actions. The memo was procedural. The human consequences were not all subject to bullet points. Eleanor's recovery, when news of the board's move reached the modest house on the block, felt almost anticlimactic. The first thing Stanley did after his badge was reactivated was go to the pharmacy and buy 2 small things Eleanor liked, a packet of tea with bergamot and a thin, soft blanket. He sat at the edge of her bed and read aloud the same lines he always read, the practice of a man who kept ritual like a talisman. The nurse who had known Eleanor for months noticed a difference in the rhythm of the couple's days. Fewer hospital calls, a steady medication schedule, and appointment with a cardiologist that suggested time, more than immediate cure, was the likely path forward. The city did not rearrange itself around the incident. Traffic still snarled, office lights still went on late. But for Stanley, the restoration of his badge and the formal recognition by the company that the incident merited investigation felt like a reclamation. He was not given a parade. He was given what dignity can most usefully be given in a bureaucratic world, an acknowledgement that the process had been taken seriously and that a mistake made by the system would be corrected, insofar as institutions can correct themselves. Grace returned to her desk with the modest satisfaction of someone who had done her job with care. Her supervisors commended the audit team in an internal message. She felt relief, but not triumph. The work had been forensic, patient, and clinical, exactly what it needed to be. There was no false heroism in what she had done. There was only the quiet competence of a person who follows the traces left by data and human habit. Marcus kept his job. He continued to work the same night shift and, in a corner of his mind, tacked the memory of the way he had faltered and then acted.
He came to Stanley's front gate one evening with a small, plain cake he had bought from a bakery in a strip mall and handed it over with something like contrition. His apology was simple and enough. Stanley accepted it. The exchange did not fix the world. It nudged it a bit straighter.
The company's public relations team released a brief statement acknowledging that an internal review had prompted personnel action and that the matter had been referred to the relevant authorities. It was the kind of carefully worded notice meant to protect shareholders and reassure employees. The press picked it up, and for a day the story moved from hushed messages in elevator lobbies to headlines. The narrative found its arc: accusation, audit, boardroom, and suspension. The sensational title that had once hung over the janitor like a shroud was replaced by another headline that balanced irony with accountability. Legal processes moved at the pace legal processes move. The district attorney's office logged the referral and sent a note acknowledging receipt. Investigators asked for the audit packet and the chain of custody documentation for the footage and the evidence bag. Rachel coordinated with company counsel and the prosecutor's office, ensuring that no evidence was omitted and that Stanley's rights were preserved. She did not promise a verdict. She arranged to ensure the record could speak where voices had not. In an evidence locker, CAD tags curled under fluorescent lights. The watch, photographed from every angle, had lost its luster in the sterile trays. It became, more than anything, an exhibit in a larger story about power and process. For the people who had once read it as wealth and entitlement, it now read as a turning point, the small object around which a system had almost conspired to make an innocent man vanish from sight. Stanley went back to the rhythm he had always preferred: the quiet rounds, the polite nods to security, the soft radio between rooms. He did not seek recognition. When the elevator passed floors full of people whose lives were different in every conceivable way from his, he did not look away with shame or triumph. He kept his shoulders steady. He kept, as he always had, the photograph of Eleanor tucked into his wallet, the edges softened by years of thumbprints. There were conversations of a modest and private kind between Harold and colleagues who now had to reconcile their positions with the kind of moral obligation that corporate office politics sometimes bury. Harold met resistance at times. He met awkward colleagues who asked if nepotism had driven his involvement. He met others who confessed privately that they had felt something wrong the moment the scene unfolded and were relieved the evidence had been followed. Harold, who had kept his father's job secret for years, learned what it meant to bring a private life into public care without weaponizing it. Callahan found in administrative consequence a path of retreat from the daily spectacle he had commanded. He was no longer the man who strode the halls with a sense of ownership. His office light was turned off at night. His name, which had once been invoked in investor briefings and press kits, was now a subject of internal memos. He issued no grand public statement of remorse. His legal counsel spoke for him in tones that suggested negotiation rather than confession. The company's actions were swift. The law would decide what the state might do with the matter. For Stanley and Eleanor, the weeks after the boardroom felt like weather becoming gentler. Eleanor's doctor adjusted medications. Her heart oscillations steadied enough that the nurse came less frequently. The stoop on which Stanley sat one evening with a thermos and a newspaper was for him a kind of altar to the small satisfactions of a life lived with routine. He had his job back. He had a son who had finally allowed him his place in the light without shame. It was not a flawless redemption. It was a quiet, hard-earned change. Grace returned to audits and timestamps as if the world still required her slow fidelity. The company instituted new review protocols. It trained managers in how to handle allegations without immediate administrative erasure of an employee's livelihood. Policies were rewritten in language meant to protect both the organization and the people who kept it running. The watch, having lost its gleam in a bag of evidence, ended up cataloged under an evidence number and photographed for the record. It'd stay in cold storage until legal processes decided its fate. It had been a symbol used to shame. Now it was a piece of paperwork in an office that had learned, grudgingly perhaps, that transparent processes would be the only things to keep power honest. On a Monday morning, Stanley arrived early. He read a new message on the staff board, short, measured, corporate in its formality, and signed by the acting CEO. It apologized for the distress caused by the incident and promised support for employees affected by any internal errors. It was a bureaucratic attempt at repair, and that was enough. He clocked in, tied his mop, and began the small, steady ritual he had always taken as his duty. A few people stopped to say hello: security, a staffer from IT who had worked late preserving footage, the building's night manager. Each offered a simple acknowledgement. None attempted a grand reconciliation. The small, honest human responses mattered to Stanley more than anything else. He did not put the past behind him as if it had been smoke.
He put it in a folder like an incident that required attention, but not definition of his entire life. The final scene, when it arrived, was unadorned. It was Stanley sweeping the executive floor after the cleaners had finished their rounds, the mop ringing and leaving a thin line of reflection on the marble. Above him, offices glowed peacemakingly. The watch lay in evidence, the board had made its motions, the district attorney had the packet for review. The city spun on.
For Stanley, dignity did not arrive as vindication so much as quiet restoration. The knowledge that the building now recognized the stakes of its own procedures, that policies had been nudged by a man's name, and that, in a modest way, some safety had been restored for others. Harold came by that evening carrying a thermos of coffee and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. They sat on a loading dock and ate quietly. Harold did not offer speeches about the future. He placed his hand on his father's shoulder and said simply, "I'm proud of you," which in the moment was not about the boardroom, but about a life lived with consistency and care. When Eleanor's health allowed her to move without the same machine by her bed, she came to watch Stanley at work from a small foldaway chair in the building's atrium. She had never wanted the spotlight. She preferred to keep her husband's life small and private. She smiled when he passed, a softness that long experience gives to people who have lived a life together. The company did not become a model of perfect ethics overnight. Systems that had allowed expediency to substitute for investigation needed time and will to change. But the board's action, the audit trail Grace had uncovered, the small courage of Marcus, the steady legal stewardship of Rachel, and Harold's decision to place family in the company's view, combined into a limited but important correction, a reminder that evidence matters and that institutions must sometimes be pushed to remember their own rules. In time, the dramatic headlines subsided. The story persisted in quieter forms, in the HR training modules that cited the incident as a case study, in the internal policies that required preservation holds be confirmed at the highest levels before deletion could be attempted, in the conversations over coffee about what it means to assume a person's guilt before facts are checked. Stanley continued to show up. He wiped floors that had already been cleaned, a job that made him feel useful and anchored him to the kind of life that resists erasure. He kept his small photo of Eleanor folded in his wallet, and sometimes, in the early hours before the building woke, he would sit on a loading dock and watch the city open. The final image is plain, an elderly janitor in a corridor that had twice tried to define him by rumor, a mop that left a thin, honest trail on polished marble, a photograph tucked in a wallet like a small, stubborn proof of human presence. The watch remained sealed in evidence. The company had made administrative corrections. The district attorney had to pack it for review. The truth, when given time and attention, had moved from being a spectacle to being a process. If there is a moral to this small unfolding, it is not one of dramatic reversal, but of patient correctness, that systems can manufacture stories, and that if someone watches closely enough and records what is seen, those systems can be held to account. Dignity does not always return with fanfare. Sometimes it returns as a badge that scans and a coffee shared between father and son on a loading dock. Sometimes it returns as a board that acts on evidence rather than reputation. Sometimes it returns as a woman in a foldaway chair, smiling at the man who has kept his life small and honest. Stanley did not ask for the episode to define him. He wanted, as he had always wanted, to be known by the work of his hands and a quiet fidelity of his life. That knowledge had finally, after many small acts of diligence and courage, been acknowledged. The cameras had shown a different picture than the one that had been broadcast on phones. The audit packet had done the slow work of proof. As the building lights dimmed and the security guard tallied the night, a single line held in the air. The truth had required patience, procedure, and a willingness to look. It had not been immediate. It had been methodical. And it had restored, if only modestly, the dignity of a man who had spent 14 years cleaning floors so others could work above them. If this story matters to you, share it with someone who should remember what it means to be seen, and subscribe for more narratives where quiet truths meet consequence.